Hi, I'm your host, Kelly Jo, and this is the Nourished Motherhood podcast, a show dedicated to bringing together the voices of motherhood and helping women connect with others and themselves through the power of sharing honest, vulnerable stories. Because every woman deserves to have a place where her voice is heard. We believe that supporting mothers is one of the healthiest things we can do for our society. There's a balance of beauty and grit to be found in every woman's story. And we're so honored you're here to listen, connect, and grow with us. Let's dive in. Have you ever had an issue in the bathroom department or leaked a little pee when you cough, sneeze, or run? I know. While these are super common, especially after you've had children, these symptoms are not normal. Or how about this one? Have you ever experienced painful sex? Then you're definitely going to want to tune in to today's guest expert episode with Pelvic Floor Physical Therapist Melissa Sundberg. Melissa has over 20 years of experience specializing in pelvic health, including pregnancy and postpartum, bowel and bladder control, prolapse, pelvic pain, hip pain, and sexual dysfunction. Additionally, in her free time, she loves getting out in the Alaskan outdoors, skiing, hiking, fishing, and camping with her family. So what exactly are we talking about in today's episode? Well, you'll learn the 411 about what your pelvic floor is and why it's important to care for it, what signs or symptoms may indicate something's going on with your pelvic floor, and what you can do at home to strengthen your pelvic floor and when it might be a good idea to see a pelvic floor physical therapist. Plus, you can get some great tips on potty training and how to help your kiddos avoid future pelvic floor issues. This episode is so good and I can't wait to share it with you. So let's jump in. Welcome, Melissa. I am so excited to have you for the Nourished Motherhood community, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today all about pelvic floor health, why it's important, how we can care for it, and why working with a pelvic floor physical therapist like yourself is not just a good idea, but actually really needed for women and especially those of us in those childbearing stages. So thank you so much for being here with us. And yeah, just a big welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
So for those of us, for those listening, can you just give us an idea? Where are you at in the world? What does life look like for you right now?
I'm here in Anchorage, Alaska. I have been practicing as a PT for over 20 years. I originally kind of started in outpatient orthopedic, treating people for kind of all the things, shoulders, hips, knees, back. And then after the birth of my daughter, she'll be 13 in a couple weeks, I really just was sort of disappointed in the lack of education I received after I delivered, but just as far as how to return back to, everyday life, exercise and all those things. And so I really kind of started my interest about sort of more into pelvic health. And so here we are, almost 13 years later, and I am, extremely busy. I see mostly women, but I also see men and some kids as well. So it's definitely an area that's much needed.
Wow. I think it's something we don't necessarily think a lot about. At least I didn't before I had a child. I never really thought about my pelvic floor. Can you talk a little bit more about what your pelvic floor is, what it does, why it's even important?
Yeah, everybody has a pelvic floor, men and women. It is basically 3 layers of muscles that do a couple different things with bowel, bladder, and sexual function. So it helps us go to the bathroom. It also helps us keep and remain continent so that we're not leaking urine, gas, or stool. It helps to support our pelvis and our hips, as well as our spine. And also it plays a big role in support. So when we think about support, we think about supporting the organs in our pelvis. We think about prolapse and just the fascial integrity of the pelvis. And then of course it has a sexual function in which, if things aren't working well in our pelvic floor, we can see changes in sensation. We can experience pain or changes in orgasm.
That's so fascinating. So really, it does a lot of different daily functions. It's always at work for us, is what you're saying.
Yes. And oftentimes when I see people in the clinic, they come to me for one issue. For example, they come to me for urinary incontinence and then oftentimes don't recognize or realize that maybe their years of constipation or pain in their hip is potentially kind of a connecting issue as well.
That's so fascinating. So yeah, there's often like a whole constellation then of symptoms that you see. That's so fascinating. Now, I feel like we spend there in our culture, there's a lot of emphasis on the core, like core health, core health. Can you tell me like what is the relationship between your core and your pelvic floor?
So our pelvic floor muscles work together with our deep core muscle system. And that includes our diaphragm, which is our breathing muscle, up in our lower ribs, are also our deepest abdominal layers, which is our transversus abdominis muscle, and the muscles in our back that help control stability, which are called multifidi. So we kind of refer to that as our core canister, and our pelvic floor makes up the floor of that canister. And they, all four muscles, work together as a team and to help give us good support of our trunk and our pelvis and our hips and help manage our pressure well in our system. The tricky part is that oftentimes some programs, exercise programs, or, are focusing mostly on things like Kegels by themselves or all abdominal exercises, when really we need to sort of focus on, or include exercises that sort of work the whole system, not just the individual muscles.
So sometimes Kegels can be good, but what you're saying is they can also like cause more harm than good at times too.
Absolutely. Sometimes they can be sort of detrimental, or it's not training the system the way that it's intended to work.
Interesting. That's so fascinating. So, okay, so you mentioned like urinary incontinence. So for women who, especially they're postpartum and, they've just been told, you just kind of got to deal with it. So if they're running or laughing or crying and they happen to let out a little bit of pee, like it's just said, oh, that's normal. That's part of motherhood. And what do you see in your practice? Is that's common, but is that actually normal?
Yeah, so it is common, but it's not normal. And I think, unfortunately, our society does, and providers often sort of give women the okay to just say, that's normal for after having a baby, which I would totally disagree with, because oftentimes there's very simple things, especially early on after having a baby, that could make a big difference and reduce leaking, whether it's a couple drops or whether it's, much more. And oftentimes, I can't remember the exact numbers as far as studies, but it often takes women, I think, on average, 3 to 5 years to bring up issues with their provider about something as simple, something like incontinence. And then it typically even takes them a couple more years beyond that first initial conversation before they'll actually do something about it. I think overall, that trend is improving, but I think it's not uncommon for me to see women, 10 years after they've had a baby, 20 or 30 years after they've had a baby, for them to tell me that they've just been leaking kind of off and on since their delivery, which for some of those women was quite some time ago.
Wow. I mean, so it sounds like there's a lot of women suffering or experiencing these issues unnecessarily, and that there's quite a bit that can be done both at home and with a specialist like yourself, right?
Right.
Wow. That's a big deal. Why do you think it's like we don't bring it up just because there's stigma around it? Or what do you think that could help change the system?
I think part of it is maybe the stigma. I think a lot of women, unfortunately, think that they're the only ones that are experiencing issues, even though I try to really let them know that, I would say most women have some issues of some sort after having a baby. I think another issue is that our OBGYN providers don't do a good enough job of screening. I think sometimes they kind of just do some quick questions like, how's everything going? Not specific questions like, are you leaking with sneezing, coughing, or are you having pain with, this? So I think it's kind of twofold. I wish that providers would do a much better job of screening. And I think sometimes at 6 weeks postpartum, especially for postpartum women, there's so many other things going on. They're sleep deprived, they're working on, nursing, there's all these other things going on that sometimes I don't think we have the capacity to maybe even deal with other things until later. And by that time, we're done seeing our OB providers. And then I think life happens, and then, months and years go by and we're still sort of dealing with the same, issues, or maybe we're, worsening issues at that point.
That makes a lot of sense. You mentioned a lot of women often probably feel like they're the only one. Can we talk about like what are some symptoms that someone might be experiencing, whether it's like painful sex or it's through pregnancy, through postpartum? What are some things that if a woman is experiencing these issues or symptoms that might be an indicator that there's something they can do for their pelvic floor?
Yeah. So kind of starting with bladder, of course, these are things like, of course, like leaking, and leaking, I tell women is, 2 drops to wetting their underwear to, of course, peeing their pants. So it could be along that whole spectrum. Not being able to start their urine stream. So sometimes women will say that they sit on the toilet and it takes a while for their stream to start. So, typically we should be able to sit down and go pretty quickly, but some women it takes kind of like a minute or 2 or even longer. Not being able to empty completely. So if they're not able to empty their bladder, they feel like they go and then they feel like they need to go, 30 or 60 minutes later. Of course, any discomfort or pain with emptying their bladder could be, an indication that something's not working optimally. In regard to bowel function, constipation, and constipation is kind of a tricky one because many people that are constipated don't think they're constipated. So I always ask, like how often are they going? So by definition, constipation means that you're having a bowel movement every 1 to 2 days. And that could be, 1 time a day, 3 times a day, or every other day. And all of those are considered normal. But I often have folks that are going, every 3 or 4 days, or they're really having to take a lot of supplements to be able to go. Not that supplements are necessarily bad, but, like they have to work pretty hard to have a bowel movement. Any incontinence of stool or gas, which happens especially postpartum, but it can be happening, of course, before. Pain or bleeding with bowel movements, which could be indicative of hemorrhoids or a fissure. And then, of course, with sex, any pain or, well, for sure, pain with penetration or deeper pelvic pain with a deeper penetration and changes in orgasm. Sometimes women will notice that maybe the intensity of the orgasm has changed, and that can be an indication that their pelvic floor is not working optimally. And then any ongoing back or hip or pelvis pain. Of course, when we're pregnant, that typically tends to be more kind of in the pubic bone in the front often, or in our SI joint in our back. But of course, back or hip pain, a few of our hip muscles are also pelvic floor muscles. So that whole area works definitely very intimately together.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Like, I think that's so helpful to know of like any of those. There might be other issues going on, but certainly the pelvic floor is impacted, so that anyone tuning in who might be experiencing those should really be thinking, oh, pelvic floor, right? That's so powerful.
Yeah.
Wow. So how does working with I guess there's a couple different things then we can do. You can do exercises at home, right? Different postures, but can you kind of walk us through, I'm new. I just identified with some of those symptoms you mentioned. What's the best next step for me?
Yeah, I would recommend that you do connect with a pelvic PT so we can do kind of a full assessment. Oftentimes, like I mentioned earlier, it's not just the pelvic floor that's possibly kind of, it's not just a weak pelvic floor that needs Kegels. Oftentimes it could be something, especially if we have a newborn or a little one, how we're sitting or standing, how we're managing our breath and our pressure in our abdomen. It could be, we've got ongoing back or hip tightness that's contributing to sort of what's happening in our pelvic floor. So, and I'm happy to share, there is 2 websites that have a list of all, you can look up a local pelvic PT in your area via your zip code. So I will make sure to get that to you so you can post that. And so I think that connecting and having a good evaluation, and I think in a perfect world, especially for new moms, I think this should be the standard of care. After you see your OB provider at 6 weeks, I think that should also include a referral straight to a pelvic PT, even if you're like, well, I'm doing pretty okay. But I think sometimes it's good just to sort of get a check-in, even if it's just a one-time visit, because oftentimes many of us are wanting to get back to exercise or work that maybe requires lifting. nurses, oftentimes I see many nurses that are trying to get back and they have to be able to lift 50 to 75 pounds. And, at 6 to 12 weeks, that's a lot of weight on a body and a core that's still recovering from delivery. So I think that even just a one-time check-in is a great thing for any new mom.
That's awesome. Would you say that like working on your pelvic floor is important like before pregnancy or even in pregnancy? Are there benefits to that?
I think, of course, I think that's good. I think especially if you identify with any of those symptoms, I think that that is an indication, even if, you're 16. And I can also provide a link to a quiz that folks can take. And then if they answer yes to any of those questions, then that would be kind of an indication that maybe that it would be helpful for them to connect with a pelvic PT. So I think if people answer, if they are finding that they're having some issues, then I think that would be good at any age, whether, I saw a 3-year-old on Friday in the clinic who is having incontinence. And I think the mom had taken my postpartum class. And so I think she was just sort of mindful of some of the behaviors and things that her daughter was experiencing. And sometimes it's just something as simple as just making sure, that we're not kind of creating some non-optimal habits with going to the bathroom. Many of us aren't taught how to pee or poop when we're kids, right? We kind of put our kiddos on the potties and just let them go. And then people typically figure out how to get stuff out, but it may not necessarily be the most efficient or effective way. And so often I'm seeing those folks in the clinic at 20 and 30 years old, and they've been having things like constipation or, for 10, 20 years. So,
oh my gosh. Okay. So while we're on that, like what are some tips for especially young parents who have toddlers who are potty training? What can we do to like help set our kids up for success?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is making sure that when they are sitting on the toilet, when you start potty training, is to make sure that they have a good stool under their feet, whether it's one of the potty chairs so their feet can be on the floor, or getting something like a squatty potty that allows them to put their feet solidly on the ground and they don't have to work quite so hard when they're sitting on the toilet, I think is first and foremost, number one priority. If a kid is dangling on the toilet, they're going to be tensing muscles, and that's going to be pretty counterproductive. Number 2 would be if they are having issues like bedwetting or urinary incontinence. Typically, there's all sorts of things. Watches. I have parents that are waking their kids up every 2 hours at night to go to the bathroom so they don't wet the bed, which of course affects everybody's sleep and such. But typically, most of the issues that we experience as kids links back to how their bowel movements are doing. So oftentimes kids that are bedwetting are often constipated, and the parents don't necessarily notice that or, aren't kind of connecting the two. The other thing, interestingly enough, is often those kids also have a dairy intolerance or sensitivity, and gluten as well, but dairy tends to be the one that's a little bit more prevalent than gluten. So sometimes just removing dairy and helping them kind of poop a little bit easier and better can kind of clean up their bedwetting issues.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about having maybe multiple things going on, right? Maybe a food sensitivity, but also then your pelvic floor is directly impacted. And that there's like this relationship where if they continue on, they just kind of have that compounding effect, right?
Yeah. And I think especially with kids, another milestone or kind of pivotal point is when they go into school. So kindergarten and first grade, kids don't want to pee or poop at school, so they hold it. And then that, of course, leads to a whole host of other issues and potentially that muscle tightness where they have a hard time going. And then, which of course links back to constipation often or not going to the bathroom when they're at school. So, and that's kind of when we start to see another sort of kind of influx of symptoms is, not just when they're potty training, but also as they go into school, because some teachers how they are let out to go to the bathroom is different. And so they can create some behavioral issues with going to the bathroom.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not quite to that stage yet with our kids. And so that's really fascinating. Do you have any tips too for like talking with your kids as they go into school to kind of help encourage them to I don't know, or even conversations you could have with a teacher or to make this, I don't know, to be able to change the situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I guess just being mindful and knowing your child's bathroom routines is important. And if there is an issue, then I think making sure that you kind of involve the teacher and potentially the school nurse so that they can potentially set the child up on a routine where they can be excused to go to the bathroom, I think is an important thing. And I actually had to do that with one of my kiddos because they were not going at school. And then she was having stomach aches and then didn't want to do school. And so we just had a conversation with the teacher and then that seemed to sort of solve that. But I mean, it happens a lot. And I don't think, I think that's something that maybe we as pelvic PTs and teachers, and I think it's probably more important for that knowledge to get to those younger teachers because I think it happens a lot. Mm-hmm. I mean, it happens in adults. We call, the shy bladder or people that don't poop out in public. I mean, I think I had a couple of people this last week that they never poop outside of their house. Like they just hold it until they get home, which is not necessarily helpful for muscles and all, that whole area. So, and I think it absolutely happens a lot with kids. And I don't think we realize it until, of course, there's other, just symptoms. So,
wow. Yeah, I feel like that's so insightful for us parents too, to be able to be mindful of certain things, because if we could help deal on this side of things, well, it's still relatively easy so that our kiddos don't have to 20, 30 years down the road, have these major issues. I mean, it's always ideal.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow. Okay. Backing up. So if someone's going to come and do pelvic floor PT, obviously, that region is a really sensitive, topic or just, it's very personal. What does it look like when someone comes in to work with you? Because I've been surprised by all the different types of, it's not just one thing, I guess, we work on when we come in and have a session. So can you kind of unpack what it would look like to come work with a pelvic floor physical therapist and some of the different things a woman might experience in a session?
Yeah. So typically on a first session with me, of course, we take a pretty thorough history. I want to know all about your pelvic floor. I want to know about, any other medical history, surgeries, injuries, even something as simple as an ankle sprain or, a sports injury that happened as a teenager is helpful. Sometimes women that I see as a new mom had a soccer injury when they were a teenager that potentially kind of started some of their pelvic floor, issues. And again, they maybe didn't necessarily realize that. So it's always good for me to kind of get a good detailed history. The other thing is that then we kind of look at just general motion and mobility of your, hips and back, and just are you able to, get up and down from a chair without having to, change or modify things because of pain or tightness, checking for muscle strength and how you coordinate the muscles in your abdominals and around your hips and pelvis. And then really I feel like I always take the first visit to really just give moms some good things that they can start doing at home. I know some women want to come when they see me, they want me to sort of just go and evaluate their pelvic floor straight, from the beginning. But like we mentioned earlier, there's so many different things that can affect the pelvic floor. And I think especially after you have a baby, you're lifting a baby all the time, you're holding, you're rocking, you're doing a lot of physical work. So it's not just the pelvic floor muscles that need to kind of just, to be checked on. So typically for the first visit, we'll kind of do that. And then oftentimes, if they're still having issues with bowel or bladder or pain, or they had a vaginal birth and they have a scar, then we can often do a pelvic floor muscle assessment. Then that typically is done intravaginally. And we, again, assess those 3 layers of the muscles. And then often a check kind of that scar. And I think the biggest thing that's most helpful for most patients with that is what's actually happening when you Kegel, because most women, and I think the statistic is 74% of women are doing Kegels incorrectly.
Whoa.
Which is huge.
That's most of us.
That's most, yeah. I mean, nobody teaches us how to Kegel really either, right? I mean, it's not something that unless we've taken a specific class or, so I think, what's happening in those muscles when you Kegel, and then what's happening when you relax. Okay. And then what's happening when you bear down to have a bowel movement, bear down to pass, like what's happening? Like, are you able to coordinate all three of those? And then if you're having challenge in any one of those, then that's kind of oftentimes where we spend, especially our initial time is, and more often than not, I'm teaching women how to relax and lengthen their pelvic floor versus tighten and Kegel, at least initially, because many women tend to hold we tend to hold our pelvic floor muscles, more tense because our pelvic floor muscles are fight or flight muscles. So anytime we're stressed or anxious or worried about anything, we often unconsciously tense up in our hips and pelvis and pelvic floor muscles. And so I think we create these holding patterns in our body, much like, tightness in our shoulders and such. And so, and then that's going on for years. And then that just becomes the normal pattern for how our body, moves and is. So often I'm trying to help women connect better to their pelvic floor and then just sort of retrain how those muscles move to make sure there's good motion there. And then make sure that they can Kegel well and relax well and lengthen well so they can, have sex without pain, have easy and complete bowel movements and, not have leaking of urine, et cetera. So.
Hey friends, and welcome to this brief podcast intermission brought to you by Nourished to Flourish. Nourished to Flourish is our signature course designed to help women build a strong, healthy foundation from preconception through pregnancy, delivery, and postpartum recovery. We start with fertility, diving deep into the biology of your hormones and menstrual cycle, learning how to balance your blood sugar and fuel your body, and uncover the power of epigenetics. Then we move into pregnancy support with a step-by-step guide for what to expect in each trimester and every doctor's appointment. Plus, how to ask for and get the support you need at each stage of your pregnancy. Next, we focus on delivery, specifically preparing for labor, understanding your pain management options and possible interventions, and being ready for your first 72 hours with your new baby. Finally, we focus on your birth as a new mother, with a focus on the 5 key elements of postpartum recovery and cultivating a truly supportive network around you. This foundational course is practical and powerful. You won't find a more holistic approach or emotionally connected resource to walk with you through each moment leading up to conception, every moment of pregnancy, and into your postpartum recovery. You can explore the course yourself at nourishedmotherhood.com/nourished-to-flourish or click the link in the show notes. Becoming a mom is a wild ride. You deserve personalized support at every step of your journey. Wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I feel like before I really was ever aware of the pelvic floor, when I had very limited knowledge, I thought I was just a rock star because I'm like, yeah, I can do Kegel. Like I was so good at the tightening of everything. And I had never really heard someone talk about relaxing and being able to release. And that is the hardest part for me by far. And I think a source of a lot of my issues when it comes to my pelvic floor. But I'm curious too, I think a lot of women in our culture, especially because there's a certain like body image, like are told to like suck it in, like at least growing up for me, like I was always told like suck in your pooch, like how does that impact is that like also contribute to this tightening?
Yes. So one of the other big things I work on with women and men too, for that matter, is how we manage pressure in our abdomen. So basically in our bodies. And oftentimes I talk about it kind of from our diaphragm, our breathing muscle down to our pelvic floor. But really we can create pressure kind of in our throat as well. So some people hold tension up top. So sometimes that pressure is coming even from even higher. And I always think of it as a balloon. If you take a balloon and you think about squeezing a balloon from the top, where does that pressure go? It goes down, right? And what's down is our pelvic floor. So for those of us that maybe are, often maybe holding our breath when we get up and down from a chair, when we pick up our baby, or maybe when we're exercising. But also if you think about that balloon as well, and we squeeze the middle of the balloon, which of course is where our abdominals are, the diaphragm's on the top and the pelvic floor is on the bottom. And we squeeze the middle of the balloon, we've got pressure, extra pressure going down, and we also have extra pressure going up. And so, and what, kind of what you mentioned as far as sort of that, holding your belly in, I think is extremely common. I think it's something that we are taught, to have good posture. A lot of our body image is focused in and around our abdomen, right? And oftentimes that's because of what we wear or just fashion, but also, images we see on the computer or in magazines. But unfortunately, that can be creating a lot of issues and pushing pressure in places we don't want it. Our pelvic floor, our diaphragm, and, our back. And sometimes that can be creating extra pressure and be contributing to a prolapse that somebody's experiencing. So it can be, and I think that one's a really hard one because oftentimes for many women, that is something that's hardwired in their DNA is to just hold that belly tight. And oftentimes they don't even realize they're doing it until somebody like me talks to them about it. And then they come back the next day or the next time I see them and they're like, I hold my abs tight all day. It's challenging, but for some, as soon as we kind of help them relearn how to, hold their abdominals a little bit differently, and then sometimes there's, many of their symptoms can go away because it can affect, GI and gut health as well, of course, as pelvic floor function and health as well.
That's fascinating. What are some of the few things or simple things we can do to start changing that, to go from holding our abs all the time? Is there something you can share for that?
Yeah. One of the things I think is just being more aware of it. I mean, I think for, like I said, many of us don't even realize that we're doing it. I mean, two things I often will have people pay attention to is, are there certain clothes that you're wearing that either help you relax or maybe increase your tensing? So for example, nowadays leggings are, kind of the fad, and oftentimes they are high waisted. And for some women that actually helps them relax. And many women will often notice oh, I don't leak as much when I wear my blue leggings, right? Or whatever, versus sometimes certain pants, if they're lower or if they just hit your abdomen funny and they're lower. And so you're more conscious of your belly. Oftentimes we're sort of holding that in a little bit more with those type of clothes. And so because, we're just a little bit more conscious of how everything looks. And so maybe kind of pay attention to what clothes you feel good in, body wise, as well as symptom wise. And then of course, wear the clothes that feel good. Don't wear the clothes that don't feel good.
Yes.
And then I think also just being more aware of your pattern, because again, I think most of us don't even realize that we're doing it. And so, I think just, checking in when you're at a stoplight, are you, tensing your abs? When you're, sitting nursing your baby, are you tensing your abs? When you're running 3 miles on your 3-mile loop, are you tensing your abs the whole time? So just throughout the day with different activities. And then one of the biggest things I think that can be helpful is just adding a nice exhale or breath out when you go up, when you stand up or sit down, because many of us are doing that kind of frequently throughout our day, whether we're getting out of bed, out of our chair for at work or at home, up and down from the toilet. And sometimes just by having you, blow out like you're blowing out a birthday candle means that you're not holding your breath and you're not holding your belly in. So sometimes simple trick like that can make, can sort of break up that cycle throughout the day.
It's awesome. That's really helpful. I think especially too with a newborn, I feel like it's also training. The sooner you can train yourself that way, because sometimes the brain, at least I've found, it's hard for me to connect my brain to what my breath is doing. But how helpful that is when you're getting a car seat in and out of the car, or lifting up your baby from the bassinet and putting them down. And so I think that's a really helpful tip of exhale.
Yeah. And sometimes for my new moms that have like newborns, I'll have them, because you have your spot that you sit and nurse or feed your baby that maybe has your water bottle, has all your things. And so sometimes I'll have them take a Post-it and kind of put that on their water bottle or, right next to their things. It just says exhale or breathe, so that when they're sitting there, even in those first few weeks, they can really just have a little bit more insight. I mean, when we've been doing the same patterns for decades, sometimes we may need some visual reminders to kind of help change our habits and our patterns. So that's often can be a helpful tool as well.
Yeah. So going back to pregnancy, and there's so many changes that occur as our bodies are changing, our baby is growing, added pressure, the loosening of our joints and ligaments. How can we, as we're experiencing those changes, better support our bodies? What are some things we can do from home even to give ourselves that little extra support?
Yeah, I think one would, of course, be just adding that exhale as you're, changing positions, or if you're lifting or moving things and you have increased effort, really doing a better job of supporting our bodies when we're sitting or even lying down in bed. I think sometimes, we think we don't necessarily need like an extra pillow here or there, but oftentimes, just that little extra support can really make a big difference, especially when we're sitting for, 30, 60 minutes or lying in bed for hours at a time. I think that can be hugely helpful. And then sometimes, some of us just need a little extra support. And that can be, of course, in the, something as simple as a belt, or, there's a whole variety of pregnancy and even postpartum supports and belts that can often be a helpful tool just to kind of help people keep moving with less discomfort or symptoms.
Yeah. I didn't realize until like our last session how much that extra support while sleeping, just a couple extra pillows. And I tend to, my husband's the one that loves all the pillows. And so normally I have my one and I felt pretty good, but it's made such a difference. Just incorporating that like one small change at night has actually, I found, taken a lot of the pressure off of my hips. And yeah, I cannot believe just how simple that was.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's not uncommon that it's just, one simple pillow or, just one tiny change can make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, it's really powerful. Okay. Let's talk exercises. And what are some of the best programs you've seen for women? Like there's so many, there's Pilates and there's HIIT workouts and there's BirthFit. There's all these different things. What kind of would you recommend for us who like want to move more, but also want to be mindful of like our core and our pelvic floor? Do you have any go-tos?
I mean, I think that's a pretty individual response. I mean, I think I often really try to encourage people, to get back to doing things that they like, but also in that, I think that the return back to exercise, whether it's running or HIIT or lifting weights or even just walking, I think, depends potentially on maybe their symptoms and sort of how and what's going on in their body. There are, a lot of great things. And I think sometimes, especially initially in the first couple weeks, I think that you can do a lot of kind of reconnecting of the core and muscle by just turning everyday life movements, lifting baby, getting up and down from a chair, into kind of, I guess, exercise of sorts. And oftentimes I always try to remind moms like how long it's been since they maybe did, run or, do CrossFit or a HIIT workout. And for some moms, they're given that green light at 6 weeks at their 6-week appointment, but maybe it's been 8 months since they did their home workout videos. And so, a lot has happened in their body in that time frame. And so oftentimes I really try to help moms come up with exercises or a plan just to help rebuild kind of just good foundational strength, with the goal to get them back to whatever exercise or, activity they want to get back to. Because sometimes maybe doing something as simple as like a push up from the countertop is challenging, well, then if that's challenging, then probably doing planks or push ups on the floor is not going to be, a good idea at this time, even though that's what the video or the class is doing. So I think sometimes it's really just having to sort of meet the person with where they're at. And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of the online programs that I've seen for especially new moms, I mean, there are some good ones, but some of them focus a lot on that abdominal tensing and kind of versus kind of bringing it back to the whole body. So I think sometimes, there's too much focus on that abs because, diastasis is sort of the hot topic. Everybody's wants to know what their gap is and how to shrink the gap. And typically the saying is that if a program tells you that they can shrink your gap or get your gap to go down to nothing, then I would run the other way, because typically that is not something like that, that a trainer that has good knowledge of postpartum bodies is something that they would say, because it's not always guaranteed that your diastasis is going to go back to zero, and that's okay. But unfortunately, I think, a lot of the programs online, some of them are from reputable trainers and people that have great background in pregnant and postpartum bodies and recovery. And some are just moms that have no training in exercise or personal training that, did a program and now are kind of running their own, exercise group online. And so I think sometimes you have to sort of kind of do your due diligence and research to make sure that you're following somebody that has, good knowledge of that.
Yeah. Since you brought it up, and I really wanted to go there too, like, can you just share what diastasis is? It is a hot topic, but many women might not even know what it is, or what's the big deal about it?
So diastasis erecti is when your abdominal muscles kind of separate with birth. It happens to all of us. So some women, I think, are so upset that they have a separation, but I try to, remind them that we all have it when we are, 9 months pregnant, because everything's being stretched out. And so we typically measure it in 3 different spots: at your belly button, and above your belly button, and below your belly button. And again, after just newly postpartum and while you're pregnant, that's a pretty, common thing. But oftentimes, even just soon after delivery, you can see some good, some changes. Your abdominal wall will typically come back together, but it may not necessarily come back all the way to, to zero. And that is actually okay. I think what the research is telling us now is that we're not so worried about the gap as we are about if you kind of gently push into your belly, if you is the tension that we feel when we push a little bit. So some women, you can kind of lift your head and shoulders we can feel kind of some tightness under our fingers. Some women, when we do that same test, we feel like our fingers can kind of just go because they don't have the integrity of the fascia there. And so we're finding that integrity and that tension is more important than like whether your gap closes. And I would say that that's true with what I see kind of in the clinic as well. But I think, unfortunately, everybody's Googling diastasis, and, so I think that's always a concern. The other thing is that many providers don't necessarily check it, I'm finding, at week 6, and that's okay. One thing that people really want to be mindful of is that they're not doming. So meaning when you lift your head and shoulders up, that your abs aren't sort of popping up, as we call it, doming or coning. And so if you're seeing that, and that can of course happen before pregnancy, I see it in men a lot, those men that have those big bellies, and you'll see them when they kind of lift their head and shoulders up, that their belly just kind of pops out. So it happens in both men and women. And so anyway, if they're seeing that, then that would be a good indication to kind of get, assessed by a pelvic PT. But I kind of find, because I always ask women if they got assessed at their 6-week visit, and it's kind of 50-50 or even less than 50% that get checked. So I don't even know if the providers found a diastasis or assessed it. I don't think that they're giving any information. I think it's more just to give the mom a number or an objective measure of where they are. So
interesting. Yeah. And I know like the latest statistics are 40% of women don't even make it to their 6-week checkup postpartum, which is a big deal too, because then all of this plus a whole lot more can go unchecked.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, kind of getting the information out to moms is tricky.
So what else like would you share that I don't know enough to ask you about, I guess, when it comes to the pelvic floor that you would want women to be like to know?
I think the other thing, especially with new moms that I hear time and time again, if you have had a C-section, go in and see a pelvic floor PT. I see a lot of moms that either, push and push and push and then end up having a C-section for one reason or another, but don't really think about maybe the effects on their pelvic floor because they kind of did both, right? Because they did a lot of work on their pelvic floor during delivery, but then had a C-section. So they kind of have, multiple things potentially going on there that would be worth getting assessed. And I think even women that just had, maybe even a scheduled C-section, connect with the PT because oftentimes doing some scar work at that cesarean scar is huge, not only to getting your abdominals back on track, but also to get your, that deep core, your deep abs and your pelvic floor back on track. So even though it may not necessarily be, directly pelvic floor, although, when we're pregnant, we have 40 weeks of pressure on our pelvic floor. So even though maybe you didn't have a vaginal delivery, I think that there's still often things that are potentially happening in our pelvic floor that would benefit from getting checked out. And then even with a vaginal delivery, I think one thing that is often not sort of discussed or talked about is, of course, kind of doing some scar work after delivery, even if it's a tiny scar, because I found that folks that have had small scars, the size of your scar doesn't necessarily indicate that injury or issues. And I think some women are, kind of like, oh, I didn't tear or I have a small scar, but they often still can have some pelvic floor dysfunction. So, and especially if you're having any pain with intercourse or pain with using tampons or a pelvic exam, then that's a good indication to check back in. I think, oftentimes it's not uncommon that women, that we're not potentially having much, if any, sex after having a baby. And so sometimes we don't really realize how uncomfortable that is until, months later. But if you're having any discomfort, I think that would be, something to get checked out pretty quickly.
That's really insightful. Wow. What would you say, kind of switching gears a little bit as we wrap up? This has been all so very, very insightful and helpful. And I think there's a lot of women listening who either can identify for the first time, like, oh, maybe this is something I need to deal with, or just add some helpful things they can do at home. But I'm curious, what about like your practice right now and, being a pelvic floor physical therapist lights you up the most, would you say?
I guess I love hearing just how people are able to get back to doing certain things without symptoms or pain. And, that varies from, I had a woman the other day that I saw that was able to have intercourse without pain, which for the first time in, 6 or 9 months, which was huge. Wow. Getting moms back to doing things they love and they miss, like running or, exercise is huge, especially now more than ever, because so many people, I feel like, especially us moms, are sort of feeling kind of cooped up with, the last year and a half of being kind of, COVID and such. And so I think, unfortunately, we keep putting others in front of, others' needs in front of ours. And so I think just, getting moms back out, moving and feeling good. And then I think also I find that, especially with bowel and bladder issues, is that, it really starts to affect sort of how and when people leave their house, going to the store or just when and so I think just being able to improve and see improvements there allows these women to not have to like time their life around their bowel movements, which I've heard so many times, like, I can't leave my house until I go. And sometimes that's 11 or 12 o'clock, but we know that life happens before 11 and 12 o'clock, right? So I think that is pretty, powerful. And that's really what kind of has kept me so inspired to keep working and really spreading the word about pelvic health, because, it can be pretty debilitating to women. And, I think when we aren't able to do the things we love and to go and leave our house whenever we need to, not around our bowel or bladder schedule, then I think that is so important. And I'm just happy that I can be of help or a resource to help women do that.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's super encouraging and inspiring. And you are doing that. You are one of the most highly sought after PTs for pelvic floor here in Anchorage, I know. And just you provide so much education through Instagram and your website, and you do online classes as well, don't you?
I do a postpartum kind of core and Pilates class. We do that 4 times a year. I'm currently teaching Renew Your Desire class with a local sex therapist. We're in week 9 of week 12, and that will probably be wrapped. We'll kind of be rolling out another class next year as well. So, I love doing community education at the, local shoe stores. Like I did one at Skinny Raven with running, CrossFit gyms. I feel like educating people in the community has been a better route to getting this information out versus sort of spending my time trying to educate doctors and providers. I feel like, just giving people giving them the power and the knowledge helps them sort of move forward with where they want to go. And then I also, about a year ago, actually taught a preteen and teen girls class about learning more about their body and bowel and bladder and menstruation. Again, kind of like when you mentioned earlier, is like the more we know about our bodies early on, then we have that knowledge and power to communicate that and, have that knowledge before we even think about having babies and our postpartum. Because oftentimes many of our issues kind of start in our younger years. Not for everybody, but I think any way we can improve things when we're younger and just have more knowledge of what's going on with our body, then it gives us the power to make some changes.
Wow, that's so cool. Well, I know there's women listening who will want to connect with you more. What's the best space for them to get connected with you?
My website is akpelvic.com, and that's probably has different ways to get a hold of me there. I am on Facebook. I believe it's Melissa Sundberg Pelvic PT. I'm also on Instagram at akpelvichealth. Email is usually the best way to get a hold of me, or on any of those platforms. And I just love sharing information and helping as many people as I can, even just from educating them on sort of, like you said, what's normal and what's common. And I think just giving people the power to kind of seek the right person to help get them going in a better direction.
That is so cool. And I love what you shared too. It's really, there's never too late of a time to address your pelvic floor. You're never too old or too far past your delivery to really start to make a difference and to see real noticeable changes, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, thank you for taking your time to educate us, to share with us. It's been so insightful, and I really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you love this episode of the Nourished Motherhood podcast. If you want to stay in touch and up to date with all the happenings over at the Nourished Motherhood Collective, make sure you're a part of our email community. Head on over to our website at nourishedmotherhood.com or click the link in our show notes to get on the list.